January 3rd, 2022. A winter storm forced several federal schools and offices to close as it swept across parts of the U.S. Southeast. As people trudged through heavy snow and strong winds, over 3,600 miles away in Maranhão, Brazil, floods forced more than 200 families out of their homes. And in eastern and southern Africa, Tropical Storm Ana swept through the region, killing over 140 people. It's been a turbulent year, but climate threats have been one constant, affecting billions of people all over the world. This year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change finalized its sixth assessment report, warning that the tragic impacts from climate change may approach sooner than expected. And even under the most optimistic scenario of an immediate slashing of global emissions, the planet will continue to warm at least until mid-century due to the impact of past emissions.
The jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. This report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises. It is a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world.
Just weeks after Tropical Storm Ana, Cyclone Batsirai hit Madagascar, killing 120 people. While an Atlantic storm battered northwestern Europe with record winds of up to 122 miles per hour. But as some regions lay drenched, others lay dry, like the Horn of Africa, which is currently experiencing its worst drought in at least 40 years, after 3 consecutively failed rainy seasons. According to the ICRC, almost 1 million people have fled their homes in Somalia and Kenya looking for food and water.
As WFP, we know from experience that we cannot wait for a formal declaration of famine to act. So for months, we have been working to scale up our life-saving support in Somalia. We are reaching more people than we've ever have before. 3.7 million people with relief.
Drought has also had a grievous effect on wildlife. Kenyan authorities say that the drought has killed over 200 elephants, nearly 400 zebras, over 500 wildebeests, and several other species this year.
The drought has caused mortality of wildlife, mostly herbivorous species. The mortalities have risen because of the depletion of food resources and as well as water shortages.
This is one of several threats wildlife across Africa are facing. But this year, some countries have argued that their wildlife populations are far more than they can handle. In May, Zimbabwe held a conference seeking international support for a one-off sale of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of elephant ivory. The country stated that most of the deaths were from natural causes, and the funds could be used to support conservation efforts.
The communities, local communities who are living with these elephants, they do not see tangible benefits coming from elephants. They're just bearing the brand of living with these animals. And therefore, for us to convince our local community that they must just continue with conserving elephants without getting any benefits, it's quite a challenge. And this is why we need to make sure that our local communities' voices in Southern Africa are heard.
Journalist from Nairobi, Kenya.
Zimbabwe hasn't received the support it was hoping to get from CITES and the international community. One-off sales of wildlife products have taken place in the past, but are widely unsupported today. And looking to strengthen laws, the IUCN Africa Protected Areas Congress took place in Kigali, Rwanda in July. The first ever continent-wide gathering of leaders and interest groups to discuss the role of protected areas in nature conservation.
We have the most beautiful rivers, forests, mountains, and a variety of wildlife that can only be found on this continent. We must therefore spare no effort in protecting and conserving this diversity.
In Europe, raging wildfires spread across the continent, forcing thousands to flee their homes. In recent years, southern European countries have experienced fires most summers, but hotter temperatures have pushed severe wildfire risk further north, with Germany, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic all hit this season. And at the near tip of the earth in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province, heavy rains triggered floods and mudslides that killed over 400 people. And in Pakistan, unprecedented rainfall coupled with glacial melt submerged several parts of the country, killing over 1,700 people.
There were around 200 to 250 people living here. We got out from homes in such desperation that we were in sleeping dresses. Our homes were destroyed with our belongings inside. Even some thatched huts fell down upon children.
Here in Nigeria, we witnessed the country's worst floods in at least a decade, affecting all parts of the country. Over 600 lives have been lost and 1.4 million people displaced. Bayelsa State in the country's south-south region was one of the worst affected, so I visited the state to report on the tragic aftermath. I must say, this was unlike any disaster I have witnessed firsthand before.
The flood was affecting us very serious. We cannot move. Also, our farms, our mother, our children, without this boat, we cannot move. We cannot cross.
Hurricanes and tornadoes have also been prevalent this year. In March, a tornado hit New Orleans, killing at least one person. In May, Category 2 Hurricane Agatha hit the Pacific coast. And in September, Typhoon Noru hit the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. Hurricane Fiona slammed into the Caribbean and Canada. And Hurricane Ian made landfall in Cuba, leaving 11 million people without power, before going on to kill over 100 people and damage thousands of properties on Florida's Atlantic coast. Unfortunately for Florida and surrounding regions, just a few weeks later in November, Hurricane Nicole hit, as the first U.S. hurricane in November in nearly 40 years.
What I've heard, this is only the third time in history down here that we've had a hurricane come through here in the month of November.
To address the major threats that climate change poses today, the annual UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt.
Distinguished delegates,
at the top of the agenda for countries most affected by the climate crisis was funding for loss and damage caused by climate change that wealthy industrial nations contribute the most to.
On climate change.
After 2 weeks of negotiations, member states agreed to a fund, a historic move that's been welcomed by many.
Today is a symbolic day. It is a symbolic day in terms of the impact that this decision will have on the future. Developing countries have been fighting for 30 years to have a fund to have recognition of the losses and damages associated with climate change.
To let you know that the overarching decisions...
But the Sharm el-Sheikh deal was far from perfect. The commitments on limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius presented no progress on the COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact, and the language on phasing out fossil fuels was weak. To many, this means the deal is far from enough.
Nous sommes déçus du manque d'ambition sur l'enjeu.
we are disappointed by the lack of ambition on the essential issue of reducing greenhouse gases. Of course, we reaffirm the objective of 1.5 degrees, but we must go further, particularly with regard to national contributions and especially the exit from fossil fuels, particularly with regard to the recognition of what the IPCC tells us, namely that by 2025 we must have reached our peak greenhouse gas emissions for the entire planet.
And to end the year, scientists, rights activists, and representatives from almost 200 countries gathered in Montreal for COP15, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference. Postponed for 2 years due to the global pandemic, the conference looked to reach an agreement on biodiversity protection, as nature is declining at an unprecedented rate, and 1 million species now face extinction. The most significant outcome of the deal is an agreement to protect 30% of land and water by 2030. Currently, only 17% of terrestrial and 10% of marine areas are protected. But not all parties are satisfied with the deal. Ahead of the conference, rights groups expressed concern that an agreement to protect 30% of the Earth could trigger widespread evictions, have negative effects on human health, and increase rates of violence. And some countries, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, objected to the text, saying that more finance is needed. The country's last-minute objection was dismissed on a legal technicality, but the DRC have made it clear that they will not implement the current agreement.
My statement, that of my country, through my voice, was formal opposition. And to the great astonishment of the entire world, we regret that this space is a space where we resort to violence against our text, a text we all adopted. And that history will never forgive us for it.
Unfortunately, a new year won't hit the reset button for a planet in a climate crisis. A rising global food and energy prices triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine sent climate change down the political agenda in 2022. And as global tensions continue, 2023 is expected to be another turbulent year. With the global population hitting the 8 billion mark this year, the reality of the climate crisis is even harder to ignore, as the frequency and scale of events continue to intensify. And even if the strictest measures were in place, the planet is expected to continue to warm for many years to come. Leila Johnson Salami, Arise News.